Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wednesday SEA Mobilities series. This is the collaboration between IPSR in-house seminar and Junction. And my name is Patra Paul Statham. I'm today's moderator. And we are honored to have Professor Paul Statham as our speaker today. And Professor Statham is a professor of migration and director of Sussex Centre for Migration Research at the School of Global Studies at University of Sussex, UK. And he is also editor-in-chief for the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, or JEMS. And his recent research interests include migration, mobility, and life chances of migrants, both within Thailand and between Thailand and Europe. And with focus on marriage, well-being, and life course. And his topic today is very interesting. It is Kathoey using tourist scene to achieve sustainable lives and recognition in Thailand. So this paper, based on the research focus on Kathoey and gay men who were originally from the northeastern region or Isan region of Thailand and moved to the tourist zone scenes for employment. So the main question of this research is how did they strive to make spaces for non-heteronormative living when confronted by the block social opportunities of double discrimination based on transphobia and homophobia and class and status. And this research unpacks which strong barriers of discrimination confronted them at distinct life stages and their agency and strategies to challenges these things. As usual, the presenter has 30 minutes to present, and we will open for a 30 minutes Q&A session. And without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Paul Statham, please.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. It's always a pleasure to speak to friends from Mahidol, and also thank you to Junction for making this event happen. I was in Thailand a couple of weeks ago and we were hoping to do a live event, but unfortunately that wasn't quite possible. So here we are by Zoom. A lot of the research that I've done in recent times has been through the Mahidol Migration Partnership that we have between Sussex and Mahidol University. And there's been a group of us who've worked collaboratively on a number of different issues, sometimes around marriage migration, sometimes around retirement migration. And this paper here that I'm going to talk to you today, that's jointly written with Sara Scuzzarello, was basically when we did in-depth interviews with marriage migrants, female marriage migrants. We also included a subsample of Kathoey and gay men, a topic that hadn't really been researched on that much. And during the lockdown period, I went back to some of those interviews and then started to think and write about it, which was actually quite challenging. So anyway, this is one of the papers we came up. There are in fact two papers. I should also mention that Dusita and Nipon were responsible for doing the interviews, and the research has only been possible because of the very high quality of the interviews that were undertaken. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so the backstory to the topic that I'm talking about today, which is to try and look at how people who grow up throughout their life cycle facing discrimination and prejudice because of their gender identification, but also come from extreme poverty. So how do people from these quite unpromising starting points try to find a pathway through life in the face of the social barriers that confront them? And I just wanted to flag up a sort of backstory to this, is that it does relate very much to globalization and the commodification and sexualization of Thailand through mass tourism and imaginaries that stretch across the world about Thai people and Thais. I have another project with Sirijit Sunanta from Mahidol on selling Thainess and how these imageries of Thailand that are supported also by the mass tourist industry and the government of Thais being exotic and open and all these kind of cliches that exist, and how this kind of commodification of Thai people is a sort of backdrop to the story that I'm talking about. And here you can see that even in Brighton, where I live, the picture on my left is from my local laundrette, and the ladyboys of Bangkok, this imagery of Kathoey that's international, that's celebratory, glamorous, but also to some degree commodified and exploitative, how this is in very much how there's a global context to the slightly narrower story that I'm going to talk about. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So to become a bit more social sciencey, the research questions. So the basic idea is, how do transgender Kathoey from poor rural backgrounds strive to get on and make spaces for what I call non-heteronormative living in Thai society in the face of these strong discriminatory pressures? So, this means looking at, it's a sociological approach. It means looking at how the high heteronormative mainstream social pressures channel lives into a very limited range of pathways. So there's not a wide range of opportunities towards people. Their kind of lives seem to be channeled in a certain kind of direction, which of course happens for poor people. But on top of that, the discrimination and prejudice faced by Kathoey again limits those kind of life chances and the directions that it may take. Interested in the agency and strategies by Kathoey themselves in negotiating and striving to overcome these high barriers, and also how that has worked through the cycle, the life cycle for a generation of people who are now in their 40s and 50s. So throughout their life course, they've been faced by these pressures and challenges, and how have they found a way through life in that. And in particular, what resources, sociologists like to talk about resources, are available to people. So what are their opportunities in terms of access to work, peer support networks, and also where did they get recognition for their difference, for their non-heteronormativity, for their gender identity. And particularly what came out of the research is how the sort of subcultural or gay scenes in tourist zones in notorious cities like Pattaya, how these very, very strange constructed places that are designed in many cases to fulfill what the fantasies of foreign tourists might be about Thailand and about their nobody goes on holiday to be their normal self, they go to be their imagined self. So what do these kind of semi-Disneyland type gay scenes, what is it about them, and how do these subcultural zones that transgress mainstream Thai society, how do they become resources for people to try and build a life? Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, we need to talk a little bit about terminology. There's a lot of discussion in the field about how to categorize and label people. In the end, I used Kathoey because that was the word that was quite often used by the subjects themselves. Of course, Kathoey is sometimes used in a pejorative way or in a negative way. But we're using it as a kind of analytical category. Tended to put transgender in front of that because otherwise Western audiences won't understand who or what we are talking about. So there's also, again, the difficulty in terminology about moving from west to east, and also with Thailand has its own tradition and culture for sexualities and recognition of gender. Again, that adds some complexity to things. I'm not an expert in that field. I've read it, but I'm a sociologist. And so for me, it was taking Kathoey as a Thai-specific category for people born with a male sexual physiology who have a feminine gender identity. And again, it's looking at the how Kathoey through their lives are confronted by social pressures based on forms of discrimination, discrimination based on the non-normative gender presentation within society, that in the case of the people we're talking about is backed up by coming from a poor background in the northeast, in Isan, which also has its own discriminations involved in the attempts to get through society. Could I have the next slide, please? So, as I say, I'm a sociologist with all its joys and also limitations that come with that. There is actually brilliant work from the queer theory studies and on sexualities and gender identities in Thailand. I'm thinking particularly about the pioneering work by Peter Jackson and his colleagues over 20, 25 years, which were an extremely valuable source for me to try and understand what these kind of the discovery of sexuality or gender identity from the inside, what that means. Now, as a sociologist, my perspective is slightly different in that I'm more interested in looking at how groups of people relate to wider societies. So looking more at second order observations rather than trying to understand what the meaning or discovery or self-discovery of being Kathoey means in Thailand. My sociological approach is to study Kathoey experiences of discriminatory social barriers at stages over the life course. So it's much more a focus on how Kathoey fits within Thai society than giving insight onto the generation of self-identity. So it's looking at the interface between Kathoey and mainstream social relations in Thailand, and specifically Kathoey agency to build what I call a sustainable non-heteronormative life, which sounds rather like sociological jargon because it is. But I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. When confronted by these discriminatory and exclusionary barriers. So to define this sustainable non-heteronormative life, it's one that an individual perceives provides sufficient material resources to be economically viable and sufficient resources of recognition and belonging for validating the gender identity. So by a sustainable life, it's not necessarily the most wonderful life, but it's one where one gets access to sufficient economic resources to survive and sufficient recognition of gender identity to feel valid and validated within the social setting that you live. Now, I took what I used to do opportunity structures years and years ago and did a lot of work on that. And then through this paper, I discovered the concept of social opportunity structure, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but it looks at how social constraints and opportunities in three social domains that are important, so family, work, and place, interact to provide opportunities or constraints that channel lives in certain kinds of direction, and how do people find a sustainable non-heteronormative life within that. And the sample of Kathoey were born into rural poverty 30 to 50 years ago. So basically they've lived their whole lives without really any recourse to legal support or on any of the issues about their gender identification, for example, not being able to change the gender on their passport or anything like that, which I'm sure you all know about. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just a little bit more social science then on the what we mean by social opportunity structure. First of all, a definition. It's a framework of socially structured means and rules available for individuals from a group to achieve their aims and interests that are culturally defined, purposeful, and goal-oriented. The idea actually comes from classic sociology, Olin and Cloud, in the 1960s. Again, I went back and did quite a lot of reading during lockdown and discovered some of the old classics. And what they were trying to do back in the 60s was critique what Robert Merton's perspective was, which is that poor people experience marginalization and anomie. Of course, the classic sociology is all about suicide, and as a result of social exclusion. And what they were looking for were to try and find explanations why some people in very marginalized positions are able to get on in life, so that not everybody is an individual suffering from anomie. And they argued that some poor people can still succeed materially relatively to other poor people like them by using illegal or illegitimate subcultural structures on location in their neighborhoods as sources for empowerment. In particular, they looked at criminal gangs. And this also has some resonance in some of the anthropological work in East Harlem and drug gangs and that kind of thing. And the idea is that certain neighborhoods, within certain neighborhoods, certain poor people can get on, quite often at the exploitation of other poor people, but because there are these subcultural, illegal or illicit milieu that support their activities and allow people to get on, even though they are considered illegal within the mainstream of society. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that expressions of gender and sexuality should be criminalized in this way by association. But what this kind of idea brought to mind was that tourist zones are zones of transgression, largely separated from mainstream Thai society, especially the Bangkokian elites. They are sort of hyper-real fantasy lands of bars and available sex, purpose-built for tourists. These people who come out to live their fantasies in Thailand for a couple of weeks each year. Officially, prostitution is illegal and Thai state claims it doesn't exist. Well, yes, we all know that's not really the case. And tourist zones, however, can provide resources for certain types of people who fit in these zones of transgression. So a social infrastructure, networks, supported peer communities, where Kathoey and gay men can gain a degree of self-realization and social advancement, albeit in an environment that is ultimately probably exploitative and where only a few perhaps succeed. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And so what I wanted to do then was to look in three domains of the social, to look at how people's opportunities could be blocked in these three domains. And the paper gives more detail on these, also within the Thai context. But first, family. Obviously, family is very important to get on socially within Thailand. So a person has a social role in her natal family that also provides differential access to important sources of status, emotional belonging, and resources and networks for getting on in society. And family networks and obligations are a crucial resource for individual advancement in Thai society. So family matters. A second domain that's important and that can again channel lives socially, providing opportunities and constraints, is of course work. Person performs a social role through work that significantly shapes relative access to financial autonomy, prospects for social mobility, and recognition of status. And there's a lot of documentation that shows there's a very high degree of discrimination in Thailand, especially for Kathoey, that reduces opportunities for individual autonomy via work. And as we shall see, quite often drives people towards work in tourist zones in sometimes sexualized activities. And the third domain, social domain, is place. So a person takes on a social role in a place where she lives, provides differential access to social structures, peer groups, social capital. So all these kind of things that can either be supportive or constraining and can either support a certain way of living or not. And in the stories I'm talking about, the key places are the village homeland, so where people set out from, this case in villages in Isan, and sometimes where they see their future returning in later life. But first and foremost, the tourist cities, which are these disruptions from Thai society with gay scenes and sex tourism. Yes, the next slide, please. Yeah, so here's just some dragged off the internet, some images, which I'm sure you would be aware of anyway, of the kind of transgressional zones that I'm talking about in these popular mass tourist cities. Could I have the next slide, please? So the interest is on how facing these strong pressures from mainstream society in these key domains can channel lives into specific narrow sets and limited opportunities, so social pathways through life. And how do people try and negotiate these challenges as they go through life? And what does this pathway look like for trying to get through life? And what does it tell us about the social barriers facing poor Kathoey in Thailand? Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Research is based on 5 biographical interviews with Kathoey. The paper itself also talks about gay men, but for reasons of simplicity, I'm focusing on Kathoey here. Subjects reflect on their own experiences on key events that define their life stories at key life stages. They face blocked opportunities, double discrimination, as Kathoey and as peasants from Isan. So there's also class and status discrimination there in relation to their efforts to achieve upward social mobility and recognition. The sample, of course, is not representative, but it's biased towards people who were successful, who actually have been in relationships with Western men for a number of years, which is the cultural script or jackpot for social advancement for people from this background. So we're looking at success stories, but from those success stories, it was also possible to glean what success didn't look like. Now, there's been a lot of research on Thai women, so this is also adding to the story about how it can be different to be Kathoey in this kind of direction. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So basically look at 4 stages in the life trajectory, a sort of narrative arc. So we looked at the interviews and sort of broke them down into biographical life chronological stages. So the first one was experiences growing up in poor rural villages. So what were the formative experiences? The second were the first, and obviously I'm a migration researcher, so the first migration was quite often to the city, and what were their post-migration experiences in terms of being marginalized, looking for work, precarity, but also getting away from home and trying to achieve some form of sexual liberation. The third was building a sustainable non-heteronormative life on the scene. So quite often people ended up in tourist zones. So how did they try and build a life in these subcultural zones that transgress mainstream societal norms? And the final one is kind of reaching back home for recognition. So many people from Isan who have migrated, the mass migrations from rural to urban and international migration that have taken place from Isan, that home and the village and the natal family remains a very strong core identity. So, how do people look back to home after that? So now we're going to go through the research. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is the first stage then, and I'm just going to summarize a few things. Obviously, the paper has a bit more detail. Now, growing up in poor rural villages, so the experiences of growing up in poverty, facing ignorance and often rejection by parents and discrimination from village peers and the community. Families need to keep face in the village, which seemed to be a very important factor. There is a sort of tolerance of sexual variety, but that's always conditional on keeping face and surface appearances being maintained. And obviously for somebody who's Kathoey and visibly presents their gender in that way, that could create issues because it was publicly visible. So there was a self-experience of difference. One person says, there was only me who was effeminate in the village. I was called Kathoey. I did not know what I was at that time, but I was happy to play with girls. And then there's, the role of parents is sometimes supportive, sometimes not. One person says, I think my mother has known since I was a child. She was always fully supportive. I was dressed like a woman when I was performing at some special events in the village, like Rocket Festival, Sport Day, Laos merit making. She was the one who prepared my dresses, accessories and makeup. And then the final line is, she never complained. So there's recognition that she did actually have something to complain about there. And then more extreme, I was very young. My father didn't like the way I am. He hit me and threw me, so I ran away to my aunt's house. And then we also saw that there was a kind of additional requirements were placed on Kathoey people to be a good person to regain merit and recognition with parents. So as long as I'm a good person, father, asked me not to get involved in drugs, then slowly, he started talking to me again. So additional obligations were placed on people to demonstrate themselves to be good people, as a sort of seen by the family as some kind of compensation. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And now this is the sort of the second stage where people, like many people from rural areas, move to the cities. So migrate to cities for work and escape the gaze of the family and the village community. So there was a clear sense of liberation, of getting away from the constraints of family and village, and pursue a sort of self-realization through non-heteronormative relationships. So quite often it was the first time that people were able to experience sexual relationships. Now, often pushed towards or aspire to sex work in tourist zones, but this was quite often driven by discrimination and a lack of opportunities for mainstream careers. And people started to engage in and feel part of this subculture, the gay scene or Kathoey scene in tourist zones. So first of all, a little example about discrimination. So efforts to make a mainstream life, if you like. This person describes how they wanted to work in a hospital, and that didn't work. Despite having a degree, I wasn't accepted to work in a private hospital or any others because I'm a feminine gay man. I did my makeup once when I was doing the night shift at the hospital, and colleagues filed a complaint to Human Resources. I was asked to leave the job as I didn't pass the probation period. Then I worked in a garment factory in Bangkok. My friend told me I could earn a good pay in Pattayas. There's a lot of foreigners out there and they pay you well. So you can see this is like kind of the discrimination within mainstream work that channels people out of mainstream jobs and into the type of sexualized jobs within the tourist zone. Yeah. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. At the same time, after the first migration, family restrictions remain pervasive. This is an example. His sister reported our relationship. I then got a call from his father asking me to end the relationship. His father was working as a senior government official at the Royal Thai Police. He said he's not retired yet and our relationship could jeopardize his reputation. I also had another Thai boyfriend after him, but I was asked to end the relationship by my mother. So again, although initially there's a kind of liberation from getting away from family, you don't actually ever get away from family unless you go to the tourist zone. And then, this other person talks about, again, blocked social opportunities leading to sexualized type of Kathoey work in tourist zones. We moved to work in Bangkok. I was encouraged by my friend to come to Pattaya. At the beginning, I started working as a waiter, yet there was a day that numbers of dancers were lacking, and I was encouraged by Mama Sang to go on stage while wearing only underwear. So again, there's this kind of social channeling. So people talk about choices and employment and things like that, but these choices are made within very, very strong social pressures and constraints that leave very few opportunities for work and making a living. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, the third stage is that once you're in the kind of tourist zone, over the years, you kind of learn the social rules for survival and getting on and climbing the social ladder in the tourist zone scene. And at the apex is the aspiration to establish a long-term relationship with a wealthy foreign man. And this can sometimes be seen as almost a type of job. So people invest a lot of work in trying to achieve this type of goal. And they rely on peer networks for emotional and financial support. So there's little networks of people who are also Kathoey, and they quite often share money. But at the same time, it's a highly competitive environment. So about the ultimate jackpot of partnering a foreign man, I decided that I will fight. If things don't get better, I won't go back home. I saw some people who were uglier than me and they had a foreign boyfriend. Then why can't I also have a foreign boyfriend? And then about gaining wealth and relative security and independence through partnering. And this person talks about their aspirations to have a comfortable life, a house, a car, golden jewelry, and everything that others don't. I just wish I had everything as from the person who had nothing before, looking at others who were wealthy so that they won't be able to look down on me. So aspirations were also social, for social advancement and achieving something in a society that had basically rejected you. Could I have the next slide, please? So, yeah, it should also be said that these kind of relationships with foreign men are not a one-way exchange. The Kathoey people also provide social capital networks to their partner, quite often wanting to set up bars or businesses and live in the tourist zone themselves. So it's a kind of a two-way street. And they also kind of over time become like a pillar of the Kathoey community in the tourist zone. And this leads to a kind of convivial everyday living among people like them. So this person recounts, I walked to the manicure shop, which belongs to my friend. Many transgender go there to extend their nails and chit chat. They share their experiences. My friends work in the bars and they talk about who they went out with. We have fun talking. I eat with my friends. So there is there's a kind of a lifestyle where they feel part of the world there. And also there's kind of access to unattainable middle-class social networks within this tourist zone. It's limited to the tourist zone, but they meet some higher class people, Thai people as well. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so now we come to the final stage of the story. I don't have so much time left. And this is kind of reaching back home for recognition. So after establishing a kind of life in the tourist zone, in rethinking their lives in middle age from a position of relative social empowerment, again, I'm talking about success stories in inverted commas. Subjects aim to use their wealth and status to try to buy back into family and into village community and have their non-heteronormative lifestyle recognized. Now, a quarter to half of income remittances were sent to parents, so it was quite often seen as a way of regaining merit and status by sending significant remittances to parents. But there also seemed to be an emotional need for family recognition and also sometimes also a nostalgia for this village life, in contrast to the stigma of the tourist zone as there is within Thai society. So about regaining merit with parents, I demolished that shanty house, mother's hut, and built my own house before I would not feel comfortable when I go back home. Now I have a proper house, a private bedroom, a kitchen, and do not have to depend on my relatives. In the end, I want to go back home and take care of my mother. I want to stay home and plant the vegetables and take care of chicken and fish. Now, these are kind of aspirations that are expressed, but quite often people's lives remain rather dependent on the tourist zone, and they are sometimes desires that are not fulfilled, and the remittance homes quite often end up being empty or used by a few relatives. Now, social acceptance in the villages tends to be dependent on financial contributions and family recognition, so also making donations to the temple and things like that. At the beginning, I was not accepted by surrounding people. Yet after our relatives participated in the wedding ceremony, which was a symbolic wedding with the foreign partner, they are happy to see us happy. He will give extra money to compensate such amount that I give to my family. So there's kind of village recognition, but there is a financial basis to it as well. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up. So each of these distinct kind of life stages of the subjects I've talked about look at the efforts to achieve recognition for living non-heteronormatively, made against a backdrop of both subtle and direct forms of transphobia on top of the disadvantages of low class and coming from poverty. Now, the big paradox is that it's actually the subcultural transgressions of the tourist zones that make them a location where Kathoey found at least some new social opportunities to access the means to build a sustainable non-heteronormative life that gave them some economic support, but also recognition for who they are. The tourist zones transgress the dominant norms and values of Thai society, but also provide alternative social infrastructures, communities, and countercultural norms that support specific forms of non-heteronormative living, albeit ones that are dependent on foreign men. This alternative pathway towards a successful life, in inverted commas, combining sufficient wealth with gender affirmation, is socially recognized within Kathoey circles as a ladder that allows a few to climb to the top. So there's also a Kathoey society where it's established as a cultural script that there is a kind of pathway that people can aspire to achieve these type of goals. So putting it very simply, the tourist zones present a chance to transform the social and geographical displacement that people face from mainstream heteronormative society into an asset. So it's the displacement and the discrimination that takes them to these places, but then these subcultural milieu become places that you can actually use as resources to grow out of. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, thank you. As I say, the paper is available. It's open access, so if you follow the link there, you can download it and read it if you wish to go further. So thank you very much for listening to me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for your talk. It's a very interesting paper, and when I read it, I felt like it's really similar to the experiences of Thai women who are from northeastern regions as well that we had, studied about. But on top of that, about the Kathoey is about also the gender identity and how they move their life into the non-heteronormative pathway, right? So yeah, I think that's a very interesting one. We have around 20 minutes for questions. Feel free to leave your questions or comments in the chat box, or you can turn on your microphone and your camera and ask the questions to our speaker. Those who are on Facebook can also type in their questions in the comment section as well. So in the meantime, if there are no questions, so I want to ask about the, I think you talked a little bit about the social, the economic upward mobility of the Kathoeys or homosexual men. And I would like to know just how much are these, remittances or money that they send back home kind of reconcile with the relationship with their, families and parents? Yeah. How much does it help?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think that it obviously there isn't one answer. A lot of it depends on what the initial relationship between the parents and natal family was in the earlier years, perhaps when the person was facing some form of discrimination. So in cases where families particularly mothers, were very understanding and really tried to help. There's kind of seems to remain quite a strong maternal bond, and there's definitely a desire to buy back. And I think it's probably fair to say, I mean, we also see that, as you know, in female marriage migration. So it's also normal for remittances and demanding daughter duty and obligations and those kind of things to be seen as a very strong driver for why people do what they do. In relation to Kathoey, but also the gay men, there was a very, in addition, there also seemed to be a very strong need that was both emotional, to buy back in and gain recognition from the village. It seemed to be stronger than one would experience from female marriage migrants, for example, because in a sense it was looking for validation from where you came from originally. And so there was recognition by some people that that there was a strong financial basis to it, that sometimes the village were quite begrudgingly accepting of the person's success, but the person's success could also not be denied. So there was a kind of, it was almost transactional. With the family, it could be more emotional and, almost like the return of the prodigal, or there was that kind of thing. But it was actually quite striking also that there seemed to be a very strong need from the side of the Kathoey people themselves to retain this bond with where they came from and with the family. And that even held in cases where it wasn't really realizable because their lives were basically established in Pattaya. And some of it seemed to be almost buying into the discrimination against places like Pattaya from mainstream Thai society. So wishing to, if you like, link back into mainstream Thai society in some kind of way.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have questions from Kun Mongkon, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. To my knowledge, that family of which members have relatively lower education in like poor family tends to do not care about homosexuality identity. I mean, do you happen to have those educational background of those family of your sample? Because I think that these may poor and lower education family like tend to support the identity of homosexuality and maybe shape the pathway of them to the like sexual activity kind of work.
Well, I don't think there's one single explanation to this, because obviously the relationships are different, like all family relationships are different. So there are different components dependent on the individual personalities that are there. So I don't think there's necessarily a general answer to that. The idea that, to answer the straightforward question, yes, we do have the educational backgrounds of the people we're talking about, and yes, for example, the person looking for who I discussed in the talk, who was trying to establish themselves in a private hospital, had a certain level of education and was trying to get on in that way. For people who really have nothing, I think there's truth in what you say, that for example, one of the gay men in the sample didn't really have any very many sexual experiences or that, because his life was basically in extreme poverty and was basically a fight for survival, and sexuality didn't really come into it at that particular stage. But I wouldn't want to draw general conclusions about this, because I think as for all of us, I think that the family variable is quite an important one, and acceptance or rejection of sexuality or gender identity isn't necessarily strongly correlated with class or background. You can be accepted or rejected depending on who your father is or who your mother is. It seemed that mothers in particular were much more supportive.
Thank you.
Okay, we have some questions in the chat box. Kun Prempida, would you like to turn on the mic and ask the question?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please allow me not to turn on the video because I didn't dress up properly.
Sure.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you for your presentation, and I think it's really interesting that you present about transgender identity or Kathoey, and I really interesting about the terms you use when you address the term transgender Kathoey in your paper. I think that is very interesting to explore further about the differentiate between transgender, in which have a lot of continuum, identity in the continuum. So my questions come from the point that I'm interested about. It would be severe for transgender. I think it's really interesting to explore about the terrible experience of people who live in the center as well, because to get discriminated, I think it's not only about you stay in the remote area, but under the law that not, how to say, really support your identity. Whether you are living in the center, in the capital, you still face the discrimination. And that's why the whole community of transgender would like to campaign for the legal gender recognition in order to support their life. Yeah, it's interesting to explore about the exclusion and discrimination that target to transgender as the whole community as well, apart from the one who stay and move or migrate from remote area to the center.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think that the point I'd like to make, I like the fact that you raised the issue of legal rights in Thailand, which I know is under discussion at the moment for recognition of people. And I think this is important. I noted that the Pride a couple of weeks ago was one of the first, if not the first, in Thailand, and that's kind of an important step forward. And that kind of in a way contrasts with the image that's presented globally of Thailand of being the so-called gay paradise in Asia. So I think that the people we're talking about are from a very certain kind of generation, and things might be a bit different now and a bit more liberal than they were during the lifetimes of the people who are now 40 and 50, and that they basically lived through a period where there was very little legal support. And this also affects their lives in very, very tangible ways. One clear difference between, for example, female marriage migrants in their relationships with Western men is that it's virtually impossible for Kathoey men to move abroad with their partners. And they don't have access to marriage and the rights that come along with that in Thailand, and they're not able to change the gender on their passport, which makes it very difficult to travel internationally and to gain recognition in other countries. The only possibility would be civil marriage in a foreign country that allows that, but that actually happens very little. So in a sense, that's another factor that becomes a story contained within the tourist zone. So I think that it's important that this type of research also has an eye on the present and looks at political change in the present as well.
Okay. I think we have questions from Facebook, and I believe it's from Ajahn Sudarat. Yes. Oh, go. I'll read the question then. So the question from Facebook asks, has COVID changed these kind of opportunities for gay life? And separately, can you comment on the distinction between older retirement foreigners who stays in Thailand versus a younger age lifestyle?
The research predates COVID, but obviously COVID has changed everything. I was in Hua Hin a couple of weeks ago for one of the other projects that we've been working on, listening to the experiences of people who work on the peripheries of mass tourism. And yes, then as I'm sure you're all aware, people had to take their children out of school, people had to, basically lost their mortgages, that if there's 38 million tourists going to Thailand every year and suddenly that's reduced to zero, there's very little support for people who live on the, if you like, on the margins of the tourist industry, but the tourist industry can't survive without them. It can't survive without the massage parlors. It can't survive with all these things that attract them. So maybe the Thai state could do more to support the people from whom it actually benefits a great deal in terms of foreign tourists coming and spending money and that kind of thing. I can't specifically comment on direct COVID experiences, but it's quite clear that it had an impact. And I certainly know from people I know that personal relations, that the deep impact that that's had, and I'm sure you're aware of it too. Yeah, the point about older retirement foreigners, quite often the relationships, the men they would be in relationships would be 25 to 30 years older. Quite often there were no longer any sexual relations. Again, this might be a generational thing. I'm very aware that these things are changing. Like, I think that if we took a section of Kathoey who were younger from today, that quite often it seems that even students who are Kathoey see partnering foreign men through social media and that as a way forward to advancing their life, just as in the old days it used to be Mia Farang from Isan, whereas now it can again be middle-class people from Bangkok looking to partner. Also, when I went to another COVID impact is that it was very noticeable both in tourist areas in Bangkok, but also in Hua Hin, that there are very few older foreign men around at the moment. They find it difficult to get health insurance. They find it hard to travel. They're scared of COVID. And so that's very much changed the demographic, which has been the basis on which a lot of these stories are built on. And we'll have to wait and see what the outcome of that is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions now. I think it will be interesting to see the lives of homosexual men or Kathoeys, who are a bit younger than, who are 30 or 50 years old. And with the social media and, different platforms, and also with COVID disruption, they cannot, go into tourist scenes and do the jobs that they do. But they move to, online platforms and stuff. And that kind of, maybe it shapes their pathway into a different ways, do you think? Or it seems like it will be, the same or similar pathways anyway?
I think it will be different. I think that I think newer generations see the world differently. I think that one can see that. I think that people might be less willing to send remittances, and I think that, aspirations are probably different for the younger generation as well, that they see individual achievement as being more of a possibility. And there's a more kind of hipster kind of cool being gay. There's a different So yeah, I think that the story will change, and I think the story probably has already changed. So I mean, I would very clearly present the research that I presented today as limited to that generational experience. And I think that just as Thai women in international relationships, there was a very clear narrative for how it was 20 years ago. I think that I think the situation is much more dynamic. I mean, we certainly, again, anecdotally picked up that there's now situations where men have 2 or 3 different relationships and people coming in and out, and there is money involved and there is international travel involved, but it's kind of not necessarily seen as an established relationship in the way that the others used to be, which were quite often ended up being effectively care relationships or for the older Western men and that kind of thing, or the relationship was quite often like father and son or something like that. It was, I mean, one thing I haven't talked about in this paper at all is the relationship between the individual person and the Western man, which of course has a certain kind of dynamic all of its own.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions? If there's no more questions, I would like to thank Professor Paul Statham again for your interesting and informative talk. And I would like to invite Ajahn Rosalia to say something. I believe that you would like to say something before we close.
Yes, thank you very much for this occasion to thank you for this very interesting presentation. I think indeed this is a field of study which still there is, in spite of what you say, Peter Jackson and many others who have done an incredible work at looking at this kind of relationship, there is still much more to explore also, because the very definition of what is non-heteronormative and is changing very fast. And there are many new definitions that are coming up, including the LGBTQI, and it becomes more and more, and many people are also questioning this kind of labels that are being given in a context of fluid sexualities. So I think this whole issue of power and the relation between financial power as well as Western, non-Western, as well as different kind of sexuality and gender, I think is incredible, interestingly field of study, and there will be many occasions to explore further. So thank you for stimulating us to look for more and inspire others to follow on this trend. I am also very much interested in the issue of how it relates to poverty, particularly now in Thailand, where the country has been battered by the COVID pandemic, and clearly is in an economic crisis. And we know that there have been various developments to try again to stimulate the tourist sector, and it will be interesting to see how this relates to the topic that you have been discussing. So many thanks for this study, which indeed was pre-COVID, but I think has implication also for the future. So thank you on behalf of Junction and IPSR for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you to you. It's always a pleasure to come and talk to friends over in Thailand, and hopefully we can do something in person sometime. Thank you very much for arranging. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this work back in Thailand, which has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ajahn.
Okay.
See you
Bye-bye.
again. Bye.